everybody, and welcome to Healthy Living. I'm Chef AJ, and my guest tonight is Brenda Davis, RD. She is the author of Becoming Vegan. She's a registered dietitian, and she's also the co-author of 9 vegetarian and vegan nutrition classics, including her most recent award-winning works, Becoming Vegan, the Comprehensive Edition, 2014, and Becoming Vegan Express Edition, 2013. Her books are vegetarian, vegan nutrition classics with over 750,000 copies in print in 9 languages. That's very impressive. Brenda has been a featured speaker at international nutrition, medical, and health conferences in over a dozen countries, and she has authored numerous professional and lay articles. Brenda is the lead dietitian in a diabetes intervention project in the Marshall Islands, and she is the past chair of the Vegetarian Nutrition Dietetic Practice Group of the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics. And in 2007, she was inducted into the Vegetarian Hall of Fame. Please welcome Brenda Davis. Wow, that is a very impressive resume.
It sounded good.
I don't even.
So
what
much,
is?
AJ.
I didn't even. I heard of the Country Music Hall of Fame, and in sports. I had no idea there was even a Vegetarian Hall of Fame. What is that? As long as we mentioned it.
It's the North American Vegetarian Society has a Vegetarian Hall of Fame, and it was quite an honor to be inducted. They just induct one person per year, so
that's fantastic. Well, congratulations on that. So I just had the privilege of hearing Brenda speak not once but twice at a very wonderful event that all of you should plan on attending next year, the Food Equals Medicine Conference in Atlanta, Georgia at Emory University, put on by Benji and Claire Kurtz. And the only problem with the lectures, Brenda, is they were both so good. I have no idea which one you should give at Healthy Taste of LA next year where you're speaking, because how do you choose between 2 fantastic lectures like that?
It's hard, and at the Atlanta conference, the second lecture that I did was a surprise because of one of the other speakers was unfortunately unable to attend, so that was just a spur-of-the-moment thing, and I was so grateful to get the opportunity to do 2.
Right. I'm glad that you got to do 2. Now, in the second lecture, they showed a picture of you at the beginning that was stunning. I mean, you looked like Linda Carter in a Wonder Woman outfit. How did that picture come to be? Because you really, I mean, you dress very, I don't want to say conservatively, but you don't dress in a revealing way, but you've got a rockin' hard body, girl. I mean,
that was funny. I was getting my professional photo shoot done, and a few friends suggested, why don't you put on some exercise clothes and get some pictures in handstands and headstands and jumping in the air or whatever. So I thought, oh, fine, I'll buy some sort of cute outfit and do it. And so that's how that came to be, and I just have to say I had a very good photographer.
Well, it was a really stunning picture, and it just shows that even though you do eat, as close to perfect as one can, you really do work out. I mean, that body came from it was built by plants, but it was also there was some hard work that went into it too, right?
Yeah, and I've been pretty consistent with exercise. I actually, this is hard to imagine, but I swam a mile the day my son was delivered.
Oh my!
Not after, before.
So
it's always, it's just been a part of my life, and I like to move because, like most people, I'm sitting at a desk most of the day. Mm-hmm. And so you have to, it's not like it was 100 years ago where activity was built into your lifestyle. Sure. It's just not anymore. And so we have to make it a priority if we're going to stay healthy.
Absolutely. Now, were you raised with this passion and interest in healthy eating and exercise? Did your parents model this type of behavior, or when did you become so interested?
Not exactly. Although to their credit, my mom has always been a very moderate eater, and she has always exercised. Even she's 78 years old now. And she, goes to exercise classes 3 times a week. She curls once a week. She walks every day. And so she was a really wonderful role model. And we always had lots of fruits and vegetables. And even as a little kid, I loved fruits and vegetables. It was just never a problem for me to eat any of them. So that helped. But I did grow up eating, a pretty standard diet, although I would say, a healthy standard diet. We weren't eating at fast food restaurants that many years ago. We were eating good homemade food, but it was certainly nowhere close to vegetarian. I spent about 5 years in Germany, and my favorite meal as a little kid was Wiener Schnitzel, which is bread and fried veal cutlets with home fries and asparagus.
Wow.
So it wasn't and mushroom gravy.
Oh, boy. So when did you transition to a plant-based diet?
Well, it was in about 1989, and it's interesting because I started university in the late 70s, and you can imagine back then I was in a very mainstream nutrition program where we learned really two things about vegetarian diets. We learned, number one, that vegetarian diets were risky, and you probably shouldn't be eating vegetarian if you were a child or a pregnant woman. And number two, that vegan diets were just downright dangerous, and nobody should be eating them.
Oh, my.
And so that's pretty much all we learned. And then I went on to become a public health nutritionist. And, I was always kind of drawn towards vegetarian just because I was always, I don't know, I always loved animals.
Yeah.
And yet we somehow become desensitized to all of that. But even as a dietitian, I was so interested in healthy eating that I found myself gravitating to eating more vegetables and more legumes. I started eating lentils and tofu and all of these things, but it wasn't, what really was the turning point for me was it back in 1989. I lived in northern Ontario, which is a big hunting, fishing kind of area. And one of my friends was on his way deer hunting. He was actually our best man at our wedding. I was married in 1978. And he stopped by the house and he said to me, I shouldn't say he said to me, I said to him that I just couldn't understand why he would kill such a beautiful, innocent animal. He was on his way deer hunting. And I said something really mean to him. I said, the only thing I can think of is it makes you feel like more of a man somehow. And it was really what he said back to me that made me rethink the way I was eating, because he said, just because you don't have the guts to pull the trigger doesn't mean you're not responsible for the trigger being pulled every time you buy your piece of meat that's camouflaged in cellophane in a grocery store. He said, at least the animals I eat have had a life.
Wow.
And at that point, I had absolutely no response because I knew he was absolutely right. And so I decided to investigate, how the animals that I was eating came to be there. And what I learned about the animal agriculture industry was for me, it was just shocking, and I felt ashamed, to be honest, that I had in any way, shape, or form supported that industry, because my mom grew up on a farm when she was a kid, and I sort of imagined that farms were just like that, where all the animals had names and they roamed around and it was all wonderful. And of course, I quickly learned that wasn't the way things happened at all. That 95% or so of animals are raised in CAFOs or concentrated animal feeding operations, and the way that happens is just, to me, absolutely, completely unjustifiable.
Yeah.
And so I had to take a good hard look at the way I was living, and I decided that I wanted to spend the rest of my life trying to contribute to pain, suffering, and death as little as possible. And so I just thought I just can't do this anymore. And I, to be honest, I was a little bit afraid, because I was a dietitian, a registered dietitian, and I had never met a vegetarian dietitian. I had met one real live vegetarian in my whole life.
Wow.
And that was it. And so it was scary, because I thought maybe I'll be ousted from my profession, because all of our nutrition education materials are based on, food, sort of food guides that include a meat group and a dairy group. And how could I teach nutrition if I wasn't, singing that party line? And so it was a really difficult thing for me. But I decided, I thought to myself, if I don't stay and try to change my profession from within, who will? And how long is it going to take? If people who are starting to get it don't try to do what they can to make a difference, and so like most people, you always want to be accepted within your, sort of your crowd, and you don't want to be disliked or be on the fringe. But I just thought, you know what? That just doesn't matter. I have to do what I can. So I did, and I have, and I've continued to. And to my great amazement, and certainly, very, very happy to say that I wasn't ousted by my profession. Actually, quite the contrary.
Yeah, you've been embraced, I think.
I've been embraced. It was quite amazing to me, but I started being looked at as the person who knew something about vegetarian and vegan nutrition, and I was invited to speak to my peers, and I was always very, very careful about being, very science-based in what I said, and to not try to sugarcoat anything. I just really want people who have made a similar choice in their lives to be able to do it really well, to succeed, and for their children to succeed. Because I feel that every time a vegan especially does poorly, they're sending a message to everyone around them that they're justified in eating meat. It's just until we have generations of vegans who've done well into their senior years, the vegan diet is kind of on trial in the eyes of the world.
Yeah.
And so it's really important that we do our best to do well, so that people don't question the adequacy of this way of eating.
Right, and I agree. That's why I think it's so important to eat a whole food plant-based diet, not just a vegan diet, because that eat a junk food vegan diet, unfortunately, I don't really see a lot of them thriving, and then that people say, oh yeah, see, the vegan diet didn't work. Well,
exactly, and we see that quite often, AJ. We see that with people who are very committed to animal rights and don't want to take time for themselves. And I think they're sort of shooting themselves in the foot, because when they don't take care of themselves, again, they send that message that, you need meat to be healthy.
Right.
And so it flies in the face of everything they're trying to do to save animals.
Absolutely.
So I think it's really important for them to remember that, and to really take care of themselves and make sure they're eating at least a reasonably healthy diet and meeting their nutritional requirements.
Absolutely. And if they don't know what those requirements are, all they have to do is pick up one of your books. I swear that, it's funny, Brenda, because it says the comprehensive edition. I pride myself on pretty much reading every word of every book that before I interview my guests, but that book was too big. I mean, I've never been to medical school, but this could be like a medical school textbook. I mean, comprehensive is an understatement for this book.
Well, thank you, and that was the goal. Like, we really wanted to leave no stone unturned.
And you didn't. I mean, it must have taken you years to write.
It was a couple of years, definitely. Wow. Yeah.
So anyone that has questions about anything pertaining to vegan nutrition, I mean, it's like the Wikipedia. That is the book to get. Really, it is. It's just brilliant. Yeah. So now, what made you decide to become a dietitian? Is that like when you were a little girl? That's what you wanted to be?
Well, I was in high school when I just knew I had a passion for nutrition, and I wasn't sure exactly what I wanted to do with it, but I knew I needed to go into human nutrition in university. Mm-hmm. And so it was just, I had a passion for cooking from a very early age and loved to cook, but then got just really interested in nutrition and how the human body works. So that was, it's kind of fun that it started in high school, because a lot of people often don't know what they want to do with their lives till they're well within, well into their sort of university years.
Hey, I'm 55 and I still haven't figured that out yet. So good, so good for you. And it's amazing because you really know this stuff. I watched you on the expert panel and my jaw just dropped because every question you just whatever it is, the stuff that like so well. It's amazing.
Thank you.
Did you ever think about going to medical school? Because, man, I think you would have, with the knowledge you have already with nutrition, you would have been like the best doctor.
Oh, thank you. Well, it's funny. When I was in my internship, I had a very interesting case study. We had case studies at various hospitals that we were at, and I had a case study of a little girl with carnitine deficiency who died, actually, but at 4 years of age. But the doctor who was her, main doctor, this little girl had about 5,000 pages of charts. And I had to, I did an 80-page case study. And when I finished it and submitted it, they gave it to this physician. And he came and begged me to go to medical school. He said, I'll get you in. He said, we couldn't figure out this stuff. And I said, that's because you didn't take the time to read the whole entire for all of her files, and I did.
Wow.
So I was able to put two and two together.
Grandma Moses didn't start painting till she was in her 80s, so you, as far as I'm concerned, you can still go.
Oh, that's funny. I don't think I'd want to do that just because I love nutrition so much. And in medical school, you don't get a whole lot of nutrition. But what I would be interested in doing is helping to improve nutrition education for physicians.
That would be terrific. What a great goal. What a great goal. Well, Brenda, we have over 20 questions, and so we have about 40 minutes left. So I'm going to let you decide how much time you want to take with each question.
Okay, that sounds great.
But we put it out on to our mailing list, and so and actually I'm going to start with this one because I actually think it's a really good question from Susan. So she talks about B12, and we know that vegans, that's the one thing we need to supplement with. But she mentions that how if you're healthy, most people don't really go to the doctor very much, or maybe once a year for a physical, and maybe they would test your B12. But she said in the case of a supplement, if you're only going to the doctor once a year for a blood test, how do you know if you're taking too much or too little? And so I kind of thought that was a good question. Like, how do you know?
It's a great question, and you don't.
Okay.
you don't know unless you start getting symptoms of B12 deficiency. But if you're taking a B12 supplement, then chances are you're not going to be B12 deficient. You'll do fine. Now, generally, you don't have to worry about getting too much B12 because you only absorb about 0.5% of any B12 supplement that's 500 micrograms or more. So you absorb a very small amount. The rest you just urinate out, and so there's not a big risk with getting too much. So basically, if you follow the guidelines for B12 supplementation, and generally most experts, to be honest, it's all a crapshoot. We don't really know how much an individual needs because it would vary for individuals and how efficiently you absorb what you're taking, and all medications. If you're on metformin, your requirements go up. There's just all kinds of factors that can affect it. But you need at least 1,000 micrograms 2 or 3 times a week. Okay. And if you're taking methylcobalamin, that's if you're taking cyanocobalamin. But if you're taking methylcobalamin, you may need 1,000 micrograms a day because it's less stable. We don't really know for sure, but it's probably a good idea to take it daily. If you're taking a daily sort of multi-vegan supplement, probably you want to be aiming for about 25 to 100 micrograms in that supplement. To be honest, I would sooner, even for people that are taking a multi, to take 1,000 micrograms a couple times a week on top of that.
Okay.
And then, of course, your other option, if you really don't want to take the supplements, is to use fortified foods. Like Red Star nutritional yeast or a nutritional yeast that's grown on a B12 medium. Things like, non-dairy beverages will be fortified with B12, but you need at least 4 micrograms in 2 or more servings of food. So for people that are really eating whole food plant-based, sometimes they're not using a lot of fortified foods. So then they really need to rely on the supplement.
What are the symptoms of B12 deficiency? And if they're caught
Well,
early, can they be reversed?
yeah, and generally that one of the very first things that you'll notice is anemia. Anemia. It's called megaloblastic anemia, which
Mm-hmm.
means your blood cells get big, and you get all of the symptoms of anemia, like weakness and fatigue and irritability and depression and all of those things. One of the things that you might notice even before that is you start to get nerve damage, because B12 is critical to maintain the myelin sheath on the nerves. And so you would get numbness and tingling in your extremities, like in the tips of your fingers and even the tips of your toes, is really one of the very first signs that some people will notice. In the latter stages, you can have difficulty with balance and walking, and eventually you can have memory loss, confusion, psychosis, that kind of thing. Now, if you're a baby who is born to a mother who's B12 deficient, you can develop clinical signs of deficiency within, months of birth, 2 or 3 months of birth, and actually develop severe permanent brain damage. And so this one is just nothing to fool around with. Some people will get gastrointestinal disturbances, you get reduced appetite, and then the other big thing that happens with B12 deficiency is your homocysteine shoots up. And
Mm.
vegans pretty consistently have high homocysteine if they're not regularly supplementing. And what high homocysteine does is it increases your risk of cardiovascular disease, Alzheimer's disease, birth defects. So it's not, you just don't want your homocysteine to be shooting up. And so it's really important to make sure that you're getting B12. And the other thing to know is that for adults, your B12 you store quite well in your body, and you tend to hang on to it. And so if you can actually go for sometimes 2 or 3 years even without an obvious source of B12 and not show signs of deficiency. But some people can become deficient within 6 months. So
Wow.
it differs for different people. And what we know is that some people have it is different. The rates of deficiency are different in different countries as well. For example, in Europe, where they tend to have fewer B12 fortified foods, we see greater percentages of vegans being deficient, whereas in North America, where we have really a lot of fortified foods, we have much lower rates. And also, I think people sometimes are fairly well informed in North America, people who are vegan are trying to make sure that they get those kinds of nutrients. And so we see less B12 deficiency, but we still see it, and it's something that we just, you just don't want to mess around with at all.
Brenda, I just want to play devil's advocate here because I hear this a lot, having been vegan almost 40 years. People say, well, the fact that, because from my understanding from the panel, that B12 is the only non-negotiable on a vegan diet. There's certain things you may or may not need. But then people say, well, that just proves that we're not meant to be vegan because we have to take this supplement.
Yeah, and you know what? Nobody ever said we were meant to be vegan. Human beings are omnivores. That's in Paleolithic times, we were all omnivores. We consumed meat. And so we're not saying that by being, because we want to be vegan, we're not saying that humans we're always meant to be vegan. What we're saying is that we're making a choice for our health and longevity. And we know vegans live longer and are healthier, so it's possible to be vegan. But for many of us, we're actually making this choice because we're thinking beyond ourselves. We're thinking about the number of people on this planet, and we're thinking about, if everybody ate animals, what that means to animals and what it means to the planet. So if your goal is to eat like people did in Paleolithic times, then, go ahead. That's, you'd be getting your B12 from meat. But if your goal is health and longevity, and your goal is kindness to animals and leaving a softer carbon footprint on the planet, then being vegan is a really good choice. And B12 is actually produced by bacteria. It's not produced by animals. Meat has it because the intestinal tract has B12, and it gets throughout the system of animals. So if you eat their flesh, yes, you'll get it, but you can also get it from if you ferment something in a dirty container, or there were other ways of getting it from food that was contaminated with B12 producing bacteria. Today we keep our food supply pretty clean because we don't want to be eating E. coli and salmonella and things. So we figured out how to minimize pathogenic bacteria, and in the process we tend to get rid of B12 producing bacteria as well. That's why we have to cook meat to death, so we kill the pathogenic bacteria before we eat it. But I don't think that argument holds up at all. I mean, it to me it's just a silly argument. We're way past that as a civilization.
Right. Well, I just said it because I do hear it quite a bit.
No, I think it's a wonderful thing to bring up, AJ. It's a wonderful point because people do say that all the time, but I just don't think it's a great argument for not being vegan.
There's an old joke that in our ancestors' times, the definition of a vegan was somebody who was a bad hunter. But you have to wonder who was the first vegan. I mean, I didn't know any either. And I was one like in the 70s. So I wonder like who had this great idea.
Yeah, and we actually talk about that in our book. We have a little chapter talking about the history, and it is quite interesting. We probably don't have an answer to that, except we do know that that in the I guess it was probably 1940s or so. I have to look at the book to remind myself. But I think it was 1940s where we had in Great Britain there was a vegan society formed in the mid-40s, and these were actually, they called them non-dairy vegetarians for a while, but they were people that were vegetarian that just felt that it made sense to not be consuming any animal products. So that's kind of the earliest history we have, I would say, although that's definitely not my area of expertise.
Right. I'm just wondering. So Jimmy has a question about if it's better to eat a raw food, whole food plant-based diet, or a whole food plant-based diet with cooked food.
Well, I think you can do it either way, but to be honest, I think that it's good to do, I guess my preference would be a fairly high raw, but with some cooked foods, because I think when you do 100% raw, it's a little more challenging to meet your nutritional requirements for things like protein, iron, zinc, of course B12, possibly vitamin D, depending on where you're living, because of course you're not eating fortified foods at all. But of course, a lot of raw foodists aren't eating many legumes, and they're often eating very few grains as well, and so it's often quite a sort of vegetable, fruit, nut, seed, coconut kind of diet, and it just is a little more challenging to meet your requirement. It's not impossible, but it is just a little bit more challenging. So I think if you love eating raw, including something like a baked jam and some cooked lentils or lentil soup, that kind of thing, if you're sort of doing 80% raw and 20% cooked, those are the foods that I would think of adding.
Okay. I know you talk about legumes a lot. You mentioned it a lot at the conference, and I didn't think it was possible, but I've actually met now 3 people that are very seriously allergic to the whole legume family. Are they screwed, or is there something else they can do on a whole food plant-based diet to meet all their nutritional needs if they really cannot eat that category of food?
Yeah, and if they can eat nuts and seeds, then they, it's not quite as difficult, especially seeds, because things like pumpkin seeds and hemp seeds and chia seeds are and even sunflower seeds are good sources of nutrients. And if you do the sort of pseudo grains as well, and other grains and lots of vegetables, it's actually possible to meet your nutritional requirements. But it's definitely more challenging for people that have legume allergies.
Right. So by pseudo grains, you mean things like maybe quinoa and wild rice?
Yes, and amaranth and buckwheat. Yeah.
I see. Speaking of seeds, I always wondered, are pomegranate seeds seeds or are they fruit?
They're fruits.
They're fruit. Okay, they're just called seeds. Okay, great.
Yeah.
So Mike has a question. He says that he's been on the Forks Over Knives plant-based diet for over 3 years now, but his total cholesterol just won't come down even with regular exercise. Are there any foods or natural supplements that will help get it down to the 150 range?
Isn't that interesting? What I would say is that he may have a familial hypercholesterolemia. And a familial hypercholesterolemia means if he wasn't on that diet, his cholesterol might be 300 milligrams per deciliter.
Right.
He through the roof. And so the one thing that I would ask him is if he's really doing a whole foods diet. Because what happens for a lot of people who are doing a really, really low fat diet is that they sometimes end up judging foods on the basis of how much fat they contain. And so if a food is fat free, then it gets the stamp of approval in their mind. And there are a lot of fat-free foods that are not terribly nutritious, and those are the foods that are really based on refined carbohydrates like flour, and especially white flour and sugar and so forth. And so refined carbohydrates, when you're doing a lot of refined carbohydrates, that definitely can be a problem. So there are actually studies showing if you replace saturated fat with refined carbohydrate, you do no better in terms of your risk for heart disease. You do not improve your risk one iota. So he really needs to look carefully at his diet and make sure, one of the things that I would suggest he tries is to eat, a lot of legumes and vegetables. And then with his grains, to be moderate, and also I'm not sure if his weight is okay, but it's really important that he get his weight into the healthy weight range. But one of the things that can really help is to just stick to intact whole grains only. So not to be eating any ground grains or puffed grains or even flaked grains. I would say stick to, and when I say intact whole grains, I'm talking about things like oat groats and quinoa and wild rice and black rice and barley and all kamut berries. These are all grains as they are picked off the plant. There's nothing added and nothing removed, and that could help a little bit as well. So otherwise, certainly, consuming a lot of herbs and spices can be helpful. Things like ginger and turmeric and cloves and all of those things. Adding cinnamon to, keep your insulin levels down can even be helpful after a meal. So all sorts of these whole herbs and spices can be wonderful. And then the other thing is to really, really eliminate any sugar in liquid form, especially. So no sweet beverages, even fruit juices. I would just eat the fruit whole, and above and beyond that, certainly there are some supplements that claim to help with cholesterol levels, but I would try making the changes with the foods first. And so at breakfast time, if you're eating a smoothie, maybe you would want to be eating instead intact foods, so sprouted kamut berries or some cooked oat groats with the whole fruits, and I would be sprinkling on the ground flax seeds and chia seeds to bring down the rate of absorption of those foods. And so each meal, you can really look at how much fiber you're getting and making sure that you're eating real whole foods.
Yeah, great. Yeah, and that's good advice for everybody. Right?
Right. Oh, absolutely.
Sorry. Okay. For a minute, I thought you were. So here's another question we get a lot. Aren't vegan diets too high in carbohydrates? Isn't that something people should avoid? And especially with the popularity of recent best-selling books like Grain Brain and Wheat Belly. And then, God forbid, we tell people that are diabetic to eat, complex carbs. So I know you could talk probably the whole time on this, but people do really seem to think that.
Oh, they do. Absolutely. It's a huge deal. And it's part of it, of course, is we've got this low carb movement. There are the paleo diets and the Atkins type diets, and which are all very low carb diets. And what people I think aren't really understanding is that all plant foods, plant foods are, we know there are no health experts that I'm aware of that would say anything other than plant foods are the healthiest foods you can eat in terms of their phytochemical content, their antioxidant content, their fiber content, and so forth. So what people need to understand is all plant foods are predominantly carbohydrates, with the exception of nuts and seeds, which are higher in fat. Mm-hmm. But if you look at vegetables, fruits, grains, legumes, even non-starchy vegetables, they're all pretty much between 60 and 90% of calories from carbs. So the thing that people need to realize is the only carbs that are damaging to health are carbs that have had everything of value to human health removed before we eat them. Mm-hmm. So we're talking about refined carbohydrates. If you remove everything of value to health and then you add a bunch of salt, sugar, and fat to it before you eat it, yes, it will cause problems. But carbohydrates from whole plant foods are, they're not only healthy, but they're really protective. And we know that even looking at populations like the blue zones, where we have the people who live the longest, healthiest lives of all people in the world. And in the blue zones, people average 50 to 80% of calories from carbohydrates. Mm-hmm. So it makes no sense to say they're bad for us when, they're the predominant macronutrient of every blue zone on the planet. What we know is when we get our carbohydrates from whole foods, we get with those foods, all the fiber and antioxidants and phytochemical. Those foods support all the healthy gut bacteria. They increase our longevity. They decrease our disease risk consistently for every major disease that we can think of. But it's important also to recognize, and I think one of the reasons people say carbs are bad is because 90% of the carbs that people consume in the U.S. are refined. Mm-hmm. And, that's the problem. We half the sugar people eat is like pure beverages. It's sweet beverages. So we have to just recognize that carbohydrates are wonderful from whole foods. They are not wonderful from refined foods. So that's the catch with carbs. Mm-hmm.
Sure. Yep. Well, thank you. This is an interesting question. Are vegans at increased risks of eating disorders? Because I do seem to read a lot of times about some of these vegan bloggers that actually do have eating disorders, and so is there an equal incidence in the population of vegans and not vegans, or is there something about the vegan diet that attracts people with eating disorders? I'm sure it doesn't cause it, so.
Yeah, and if we look at what we know about sort of eating disorders in vegans and other vegetarians, what we know is that a lot of experts actually believe that vegan diets and other types of vegetarian diets increase our risk of eating disorders because there are more people with eating disorders who are vegetarian. The percentage of people with eating disorders who are vegetarian is really high. So they assume that, it was a causal factor in people developing an eating disorder, and it's just not true at all. In fact, what happens is that that people who develop an eating disorder become pseudo-vegetarians quite often, which really means that they are using a vegetarian diet as a means to sort of facilitate a restriction or an elimination of high-fat, high-calorie foods. So the vegetarian label just sort of legitimizes them removing foods from their diet. And in fact, there are some studies that show that the rate of developing eating disorders is actually lower in vegan populations.
Didn't know that. Yeah.
Yeah, and so for real true vegans. And I think part of it is that when you think about why people develop eating disorders, it's often there are issues of control, and it's a lot of psychology. It's a disorder of the mind, really, and we sometimes are very consumed with how we look, and that sort of triggers it. Whereas with a lot of vegans, they're not as concerned about how they look; they're more concerned about the animals and the environment, and so they tend to be quite focused on, I guess, more others focused than self focused. And so the rate of disorders tends to be a little bit lower in vegan circles. So, but I think it's important to recognize, and especially for people who are dealing with those with eating disorders, that there are some people who are pseudo-vegetarian, and for those people, recovery may mean going back to an omnivorous diet. But for people who are truly vegetarian or vegan, there is absolutely zero need to introduce animal products as they recover. They can recover perfectly well on a vegan or vegetarian diet.
Excellent. That's great. Well, here's the one we hear a lot, Brenda. If I had a nickel for every time I heard this, I could retire. Can people get enough protein and all the essential amino acids on a vegan diet without animal protein?
And it's true. We all get asked this, and because in our culture we equate meat with protein, and that's how we sort of were educated as kids even, eat your protein, eat your meat, they're one and the same, right? And so I think one of the things that helps people to understand this a little better is to get people to think about the very biggest animals on the planet, land mammals especially. If you think about elephants and gorillas and all of these huge animals that are completely vegetarian or predominantly vegetarian. They might get in a few insects, but basically they eat mostly plants. And their muscles are far, far bigger than humans. And so it's really not that big of a deal for people to get enough protein. As a matter of fact, if you want to see what people can do with just plants, go to a website called veganbodybuilding.com, and you will see all kinds of very buff vegans who are competitive athletes, who are competitive bodybuilders, who do so without any animal protein at all. And what we need to remember is we need maybe 10-15% of calories from protein, and the average vegan, that's exactly what they get. So it's not that difficult. So we might need, say, for women, maybe 50 or 60 grams of protein a day, and for men, maybe 60 to 80 or so. And a serving of tofu can contain 20 grams. A serving of legumes is 15 to 20 grams. A serving of wheat or kamut or spelt, a cup, is 10 to 13 grams. So, a quarter cup of pumpkin seeds has 10 grams. A quarter cup of hemp seeds has 13 grams. It's really not that much different than what you're going to be getting from animal products. The thing is that the protein in plant foods is just slightly less digestible if they're in the whole form. Mm-hmm. So we sometimes recommend that vegetarians get a little bit more protein if they're eating mostly whole plant foods. Mm-hmm. But if you look at the digestibility, it's interesting that things like bread and peanut butter and tofu, the digestibility of the protein from those foods is pretty much the same as it is from animal products. But it's maybe 10 or 15% lower in things like whole grains and legumes. So we can sort of factor that in when we're looking. But it really, if you're getting enough calories, which isn't really much of a challenge for people in North America. But if you're getting enough calories and you're eating a reasonable variety of nutritious plant foods, it's actually pretty hard not to get enough protein.
Mm-hmm.
And the only way that I see people really blowing it is not getting enough calories. So say they have anorexia nervosa or something like that, or they eat a diet that is a junk food diet. So they're eating, a lot of French fries and drinking soda and just eating a lot of junk. They may not get enough protein. And the other group that may be somewhat challenged is fruitarians, because fruit is one of the few plant foods that contains less than 10% of calories from protein. And so if you base your diet primarily on fruit, and you're not eating a lot of greens and seeds and those kinds of foods, then you may fall short in protein.
What is the, as long as you mentioned, what is the efficacy of a fruitarian diet? To me, it just doesn't sound very satisfying to not have any sweet potatoes or quinoa in my diet,
Oh, exactly. So it and it's a fairly high fructose diet. Not that our bodies can manage the fructose in fruit quite well, but when your diet is predominantly fruit, that ups the ante a lot. And there are nutrients like iron and zinc and protein that are an issue with fruitarian diet. So it's not a diet that I would recommend, and it's certainly not a diet I would recommend for growing children.
Yeah, for children. Yeah, you mentioned iron deficiency. Are vegans at greater risk? That seems to be another myth, that vegans are at greater risk for iron deficiency.
Yes, it is, and certainly we know that vegetarians, and this surprises people, but we actually know that vegetarians and vegans don't have a higher risk of iron deficiency anemia. But they do have lower iron stores, so serum ferritin is lower. But what's really interesting is that is probably a health advantage, not a disadvantage, because when you have lower, if it, unless it's really, below normal, it's usually at the sort of the lower end of the normal range. And what we're seeing is lower serum ferritin tends to be associated with less chronic disease, because when you have a lot of iron in your system, it acts as a pro-oxidant, especially heme iron, or the iron from meat. So it increases oxidative stress in the body. So definitely we need to be, I guess, concerned about iron to some extent, but it's not something that we see, more deficiency in vegetarians or vegans. But we do need to just be aware of a couple of things, and that is that if we consume a diet that's really high in phytates or really high in polyphenolic compounds like tannins, then we reduce the absorption of iron. And phytates, the main source is actually wheat bran. And so vegans shouldn't really be sprinkling wheat bran on all of their food like a lot of people do, especially on their breakfast cereal and so forth, because it really inhibits the absorption of minerals, not just iron, but zinc as well. So that's something that we shouldn't do. And the other thing is, if we do tend to be on the low side for iron, is we would want to just be conscious of these polyphenolic compounds, which actually, if you drink, say, black or green tea with your meal, you could reduce the iron absorption by up to 90%. So we want to, keep those drinks separate from our meals. So maybe be consuming our tea an hour or a couple of hours after eating. And then the other thing to be aware of is just that foods that are rich in compounds like vitamin C and organic acids can actually really boost our iron absorption. So, and even garlic and onions and different spices like turmeric and ginger and some of the, hot peppers and those kinds of things can also boost, and even carotenoids in foods can boost absorption of iron. And then if you find that your iron does tend to be on the low side, the other thing you can do is cook foods in cast iron, and you actually increase the iron content of the food. And then the other thing is just to be aware that, the most concentrated sources of iron in the plant kingdom are really legumes, some grains, some seeds, actually pumpkin seeds are a really good source, and then fortified foods, but you really, that's just another reason that you want to be including legumes on a regular basis.
Yeah. Wow. Did anybody ever tell you you're a real smarty pants? Very, very thorough. We probably need 3 times the amount of time to get to all the questions. But here's another one I'm sure you hear a lot. But if we eliminate dairy products, how are we going to get enough calcium?
And of course, we again, it's something that we learn as little kids, that if we don't drink our milk, we're just going to be a pile of blood and skin on the ground. We won't have any bones. And it's really a product of the dairy industry. They've been very, very influential in sort of nutrition guidelines and recommendations. And certainly drinking milk, milk is a rich source of calcium. We get about 300 milligrams per cup. I tell people we get about twice that from moose milk. It doesn't make it an essential food. To me, it really defies rationality to assume that any species, humans or otherwise, would require the milk of another species for their survival. It would just be a big blunder of nature.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't mean they're not rich sources of the nutrient, but there are all sorts of other sources. And I think it's good for people to know that in Paleolithic times, people consumed somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 milligrams of calcium without any dairy products at all, and they got most of it from wild plants, and we can get it from a wide variety of foods. Almost everything that vegans eat, if they're eating whole foods, provides some calcium. Whereas if you're consuming sort of an omnivorous diet, well, meat is not a great source of calcium. So a big chunk of your calories are taken up by that, and you're not getting bits of it like vegans do in everything. But we do, as vegans, need to be conscious of calcium, because we've got studies showing that people that aren't paying attention to calcium tend to have higher risk of fractures. Vegans who do take care of calcium and get enough tend to not be at increased risk at all. But what you need to know is really the best sources are greens that are low in oxalic acid. So there are some greens that are high in oxalic acid. They have a lot of calcium, but that calcium is bound to oxalates, and you just can't get it out of, you can't, absorb it out of the greens. So things like spinach, beet greens, and Swiss chard are really high in oxalic acid. Whereas greens like kale and broccoli and all the Chinese greens like gailan and sui choy and bok choy, turnip and mustard greens are all really wonderful sources. Collards are a little bit in between. They're a little higher in oxalates than some of the other greens I mentioned, but they're still a relatively good source of calcium. And then tofu that's made with calcium is an excellent source of calcium. And then things like legumes and soy milk and even sweet potatoes, we absorb probably somewhere 20 to 30% of the calcium from those foods. And it's not that much different. Dairy products, we get about 32 to 34% of the calcium from those foods. And the low oxalate greens, it's over 40% that we would absorb.
That's amazing.
So I mean, it's really not that challenging to get enough calcium, and it really helps if you do consume a non-dairy beverage to make sure it's fortified with calcium, and then that kind of gives you a boost. If you have 1 cup of that beverage, you're boosting your calcium by about 300 milligrams a day, and that'll quickly push you up to 1,000 milligrams or more. And from a personal perspective, I've been vegan a long time, since the late 80s, and my mom developed osteoporosis on a very generous dairy diet. She loves yogurt, and she always consumed dairy products, and so she developed osteoporosis at fairly early. And being a slim Caucasian female, I was considered at very high risk. So my doctor sent me for sort of the gold standard test for bone mineral density, and my lumbar spine was about 2.5 standard deviations above expected, and my right femur was about almost 2 standard deviations above.
Wow.
And osteoporosis is like 2.5 standard deviations below peak bone mass. My doctor looked at me and he said, I don't know what you're doing, but whatever you're doing, keep doing it because your bones are made of steel. So, and to be honest, I think for me it's a combination of I've been really conscious of calcium, vitamin D, and the other nutrients that are important to bone health, like vitamin K and folate and magnesium and potassium and all of those things. But I also do a lot of weight-bearing exercise. I do push-ups and handstands and jump up and down, and all of those things are really important. Jogging and that all, when you do weight-bearing exercises, you're really sending a message to your bones that they need to stay strong. Right. And so you kick in that mechanism that ensures that you maintain an appropriate bone density.
What exercise do you exercise every day? Even when we were in Atlanta last week, were you exercising every day too?
Well, the only time that I might not exercise is when I'm on a conference and my days are really full. But when I was in Atlanta, I did go for a run the first day I arrived, and the last day, so that was on Thursday was it? No, I arrived Friday. Mm-hmm. And then Saturday I didn't do a lot except for a little bit in my room. And then Sunday I did go on the elliptical and did some weights. So I do try at home, I do exercise every day. And I try to do a minimum of an hour. But usually I actually do more because I'm sitting on my butt all day. Mm-hmm. I really like to go out in the woods and do cross-country skiing or running, but I also love to do classes at the gym. So I love all of the classes. I love yoga, but I also love, step and boot camps and all of that stuff.
So you're so lucky because it comes naturally to you. I mean, I do exercise, Brenda, but I can't really say I love it. And I was very late to the party, and I think a lot of people just don't love it, just like they don't love eating vegetables.
Yeah. And so again, you can, just like you can build up your taste for vegetables and learn wonderful ways of doing them, you need to think to yourself, what type of activity do I love? Because you don't have to go to a gym. You could play badminton. You could play a game. You could play volleyball or some sort of pickleball or whatever it is. Or you could walk with your friends instead of sitting and having, a tea or a coffee at the little shop. You could be visiting while you walk in the woods or something
Sure.
like that. And so I think at the very least people should be walking.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's what's so great about having a rescued pet or any pet is you really have to walk. So.
Oh yes, absolutely. I couldn't agree more.
It's so funny when you said think about what you enjoy doing. The first thing that popped in my head was going to the movies. And nowadays the theaters have recliners, so we're not even sitting up anymore. We're laying.
Oh my, yeah. Think about what activities you loved when you were young, because sometimes even dancing. Some people just love dancing. Take dance classes again. Just think about those I mean, it's true. Some people just have never liked any physical activity,
right? Yeah,
and then they just need to really dabble, try all sorts of different things. And the truth is that you tend to love what you're good at.
Sure.
And when you're not good at fitness, and you have two left feet, and it's harder. So you really have to work harder at finding something that you feel comfortable with. Well, sometimes it's getting the right teacher.
I'm very good at reclining, so no, just kidding. So I can't believe how fast this hour went. So Brenda, do you have a website or a mailing list if people wanted to get in touch with you or find out where you're speaking? We know for sure that on January 17th, 2016, you're going to be speaking at Healthy Taste of LA, along with last week's guests, Dr. Michael Clapper and Dr. Esselstyn and Ann and Jane Esselstyn and Dr. Michael Greger. But if people wanted to find out more about your work or your books or get in touch with you, what would be the best website for them to go to?
Right. I've got a couple. One is BrendaDavisRD.com.
Mm-hmm.
And the other is becomingvegan.ca.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
Nice.
So that's the one that sort of, is our books, really.
Great.
But the BrendaDavisRD.com has quite a few recipes and articles, and it even has a lot of my slides from presentations.
Oh, wonderful.
For people that are wanting just to check the slides when they've seen. I've got a lot of my main presentations there.
Excellent.
Yeah.
We're just about out of time, but I do have to ask this question because it's one of my favorite questions to ask all my guests. Who in your life has inspired you the most? Doesn't have to necessarily be a vegan, but just, in general.
In general. Oh boy, that is such a good question. And I'll think about the sort of the vegans. I have been very, very inspired by John Robbins. I've been very inspired by Jane Goodall. And of course Albert Schweitzer. I just absolutely love that man, even though I don't know him. I never knew him. I love him. There's something about him that just is so beautiful to me.
Well, I love his famous quote that until man extends his circle of compassion to all living things, he himself will not find peace. I think that's just a wonderful quote, and it's so true.
Yes, and there's another quote that I just love by Albert Schweitzer, and that's, "The thinking man must oppose all cruel customs, no matter how deeply rooted in tradition and surrounded by a halo. When we have a choice, we must avoid bringing torment and injury into the life of another, even the lowliest creature."
That is just, you couldn't have ended on a better note. That is just, I haven't heard that quote. That is lovely. You're not just a dietitian's dietitian, but you really are a true, you've got the animal piece, which a lot of people don't, and it's just, I think that's what makes you just so special.
Oh, thank you, AJ. Well, it really is why I do what I do.
And you do it healthfully. See, so you can have it both. You can be a compassionate person and a healthy vegan at the same time.
Absolutely.
It's not one
and that you should be.
Right. Well, Brenda, it has been just such a pleasure talking to you. It was great seeing you last weekend, and I cannot
You too, AJ.
in LA.
And thank you for all the wonderful work you're doing.
And thank you. And you make your may I ask your age, because you look amazing?
Yes, I'm 56. I'll be 57 in January.
Wow, you look like
we're almost the same age.
That's right. I think you were born 1 year before me, actually. So, well, thank you so much, Brenda. And it's just a pleasure talking to you. And thanks to all of you. Yeah, thank you. Right, and thanks
Have
everyone.
A good night.
You too. And thank you all for listening to another episode of Healthy Living. I'm Chef AJ, and I make healthy taste delicious. Good night, everyone.